Welcome everyone to another wonderful members only Heterodox Academy workshop. We have some really wonderful hosts here today, which I will introduce in a moment to you. But again, thank you for joining us. We love having these member only workshops and we love seeing the turnout and the engagement for these. So we're very excited for today. Before I turn the floor or the Zoom floor over to our workshop hosts for today, I just wanted to highlight a few housekeeping things for you. First is we have several events upcoming for Heterodox Academy. The first is a launch party for Steven Pinker's new book. So if you are in the New York City area, that is on September 24th at 6 p.m. in the evening. We would love to see you and meet and greet with Steven Pinker and talk about his latest book, Everyone Knows That Everyone Knows. We also, if you're in the Mid-Atlantic region or in, a couple hours of Maryland, University of Maryland, we would love to join you for our regional conference hosted by University of Maryland. That's occurring later this month on September 26th and 27th. And Marisa will drop some information on that in the chat. And for those of you up north in Canada or in the Pacific Northwest, we do have a regional conference occurring in Canada on October 27th. So we would love to see you there as well. And we'll be hosting some more regional conferences in the spring. So just always keep an eye out for those as well. We may be coming to a state campus near you in the near future. As always, these are member exclusive and we grow as we have more members. So as you are returning to campus this week, please do encourage a colleague to join Heterodox Academy. We're always grateful for member referrals. And with that, I will turn it over to our hosts today and briefly introduce them before finally muting my microphone for a little while. But we have more friends from FIRE here this week. We have Graham Puro, who has worked on FIRE's campus rights advocacy team for more than 4 years, earning victories for the expressive rights of students and faculty across the political spectrum. He is currently FIRE's Faculty Legal Defense Fund Fellow, where he connects public university faculty members under disciplinary threat with attorneys in qualifying cases. And we also have Will Harris, who is a strategic campaign specialist on FIRE's campus rights advocacy team, where he leads advocacy campaigns to defend student rights and help secure victories for campus free speech. As part of his work to identify, cultivate, and activate free speech advocates, William oversees FIRE's Let's Talk program, helping students develop civil discourse skills and become effective advocates for free speech on campus. And I will turn it over to Graham and Will. Thanks for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nicole. And as Nicole said, thank you all very much for joining us today. We're very excited to get a chance to spend the next hour or so talking about the state of the First Amendment and free speech on campus. And what I'm going to do is run through a little bit of background about what the First Amendment does and does not protect for faculty members, what faculty members' expressive rights are, and conclude with a Q&A portion, and also give you some resources that FIRE, has for faculty members. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so everyone can see this presentation. And I will get started. Many of you are probably already familiar with what FIRE is. But in case you're not, I'm just going to run through a very quick background about what FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, is. So we are a nonpartisan nonprofit dedicated to defending and sustaining free speech rights nationwide, with a particular focus on civil liberties at our nation's colleges and universities. We fight for freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of conscience, legal equality, and due process on campus, and free speech and thought everywhere. FIRE defends, educates, lobbies, publicizes, and litigates as necessary. So with that boilerplate out of the way, broadly speaking, what are faculty expressive rights? So the way that we think about them is that they fall into these broad rights. The first is the right to speak on matters of public concern outside the classroom. The second is the right to choose how to approach ideas and course materials in classroom lectures and presentations. The third is to research and publish without interference from university administration. The fourth is the right to participate in departmental as well as university college governance. And the fifth is the right to organize and participate in union activity. Now, you all probably have experience with at least one of these categories. Many of you will have experience with multiple categories here. But it's important to note just how vital the First Amendment and First Amendment rights are to the job that faculty do, both inside and outside the classroom. And that qualifies at both public universities that are bound by the First Amendment, and private universities that make promises of free expression and academic freedom, a topic that I'll talk about a little bit more. So public institutions, as I just said, are bound by the First Amendment, and I'll talk a little bit about the legal doctrine that gives us this claim that the First Amendment protects academic freedom. The amendment provides broad, sweeping protections for what faculty members are able to do through the right of academic freedom as a corollary to the First Amendment. Private institutions are bound by their policies, generally speaking. There are some exceptions. The Leonard Law in California, for example, mandates that private non-religious institutions extend to students rights commensurate with those protected by the First Amendment. But broadly speaking, private institutions are only bound by the policies that they lay out in their handbook, and that their accreditation requires them to have. Now, FIRE consistently argues that the policies at a private institution are morally binding, at the very least, as a floor. And whether or not these private institutions are legally bound by their policies is actually a matter of much debate for courts across the country. Certain courts have held that the relationship established in a faculty handbook, for example, does create a contractual obligation on behalf of the faculty to uphold the rights of faculty members to academic freedom and free expression. But again, that's a subject for debate. So, faculty handbooks are important for obviously a number of reasons, but primarily they will establish exactly what an institution will protect on campus. So, at FIRE, we like to say, you know your rights, and the way to do that is to look at your institution's policies. What does it promise to protect? Does it say that it will hold other values above the values of free expression and academic freedom? What does it say you're able to exercise inside and outside the classroom? And then finally, have you seen the institution in action protecting expressive rights? We at FIRE have said many times that the best way to establish credibility on the policies that institutions lay out is to follow through on them in public when challenged. So it's important here, as I'm sure many of you do, to watch what your institution does in the public space when they're challenged on free speech issues. So let's get into some broad categories here. What is academic freedom? How does it protect faculty members? And why is it important? Well, let's start with the First Amendment, the text of which is laid out there, and the 5 freedoms of which are laid out there. So academic freedom under the First Amendment. And let me get a little legal here for a little bit. Hopefully no one's eyes totally glaze over. But I want to talk about 3 really important court cases that shape the way that we think about and the courts think about free speech on campus. So the first of these actually didn't implicate faculty speech, but gave us the precedent that the First Amendment binds public institutions, and that is Healy versus James. And one of the great things about describing these court cases is that a lot of the facts sound very familiar, even if these cases happened decades ago. And that's because the principles that the First Amendment deals with really, and intersecting with the political issues that are dealt with over time, truly are timeless. So in Healy v. James, students at a state college in Connecticut attempted to gain recognition for a campus chapter of the left-wing student group, Students for a Democratic Society, which was well known for its anti-war and pro-civil rights protests on campus, oftentimes protests that became disruptive to campus activities. The college president denied Students for Democrat, the campus chapter of SDS, recognition on the grounds that he believed the group stood for values that were antithetical to what his public state college stood for. The students sued, and the case ended up going all the way to the Supreme Court, which overturned the decision of the college president to deny recognition, basically finding that the president was discriminating on the basis of viewpoint, something that the First Amendment prohibits. And this precedent established that the First Amendment, which abhors viewpoint discrimination, applies to public universities. And I believe that this case occurred in the 1950s, several decades ago. And it's interesting how we're still dealing with issues of campus recognition of student groups even today, just to show how timeless rather, these cases can be. So the second case I want to discuss is Sweezy v. New Hampshire. Which gives us this great quote about imposing a straitjacket upon the intellectual leaders in our colleges and universities and how that would imperil the future of the country. So in Sweezy v. New Hampshire, a professor at a state university in New Hampshire was being interrogated by the state attorney general, who was acting under a mandate during the Second Red Scare, to determine whether or not they were quote unquote subversive persons in the state, aka communist agents in the state. And the professor asked most of the questions that the state attorney general gave to him, but he refused to answer questions regarding a lecture he had given at his university, presumably which touched on some potentially communist adjacent topics or values, as well as the professor's knowledge of the Progressive Party's activities in the state. And he justified his refusal by citing the First Amendment and his own First Amendment rights. This went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court sided with the professor and accepted academic freedom's root in constitutional law. And that is the big important takeaway here. The root of academic freedom in First Amendment and constitutional law. And the court stated that scholarship cannot flourish in an atmosphere of suspicion and held that faculty must be able to feel free to inquire, to study, and to evaluate without fear of administrative reprisal. And finally, Keishian versus the Board of Regents of the State University of New York. And this is where we get very explicitly the court laying out that academic freedom is of quote unquote special concern to the First Amendment. And here, faculty members and a non-faculty employee at the university in question had their employment either terminated or threatened because of a requirement of the university trustees that members certify that they were not members of the Communist Party. The faculty members and non-faculty employee, concerned about this effective ideological litmus test, sued, arguing that such a requirement from a public state university to basically affirm that they were not members of the Communist Party, arguing that this requirement was unconstitutional and violated their rights. And the court ruled on behalf of the employees. The importance of the case here, once again, being that the infringement on academic freedom that such an affirmation was required and would have imposed on these faculty members and this non-faculty employee violated the First Amendment rights. So there we have three cases that give us, obviously there are a number of others that impact the way that we think about free speech on campus, but these three cases are fundamental to the way that we think about the First Amendment on campus. So why is this important for us to defend? Well, what academic freedom allows for is it allows for things like faculty members to pursue the pursuit of truth, whether that's through research or classroom instruction. It allows them to develop knowledge, again, either through research, through teaching students, through inquiring, through debating. It allows for heterodox thought. It allows for faculty members to dissent from campus orthodoxy or dissent from general narratives, to make counter arguments, to push others in their thinking, in their arguing, in their speaking. And it is the general recognition that members of the academy must be free to research, teach, and debate ideas without undue censorship and outside interference. So what does this actually look like in practice? And this is where we get into some of the specifics about faculty speech rights. And the way that this courts have thought about this issue is through something called the Pickering-Connick balancing test, and then a corollary exception made in a case called Garcetti v. Ceballos, and an exception made for academic freedom. So to keep things dry here and run through another couple of court cases, I want to talk a little bit more about this balancing test and how that actually implicates your day-to-day as a faculty member. So that balancing test has two parts. The first threshold question is whether an employee or a faculty member spoke on a matter of public concern. And what this means is if you're posting on social media about, say, the Israel-Gaza war, or the war in Ukraine, or the 2024 presidential election, all of those issues are very clearly and obviously matters of public concern. However, if you are posting on social media about a dispute that you're having, say, with a fellow employee in your department, or how you're angry that you got passed over for a promotion, there could be circumstances where that would constitute speech on a matter of public concern. But if you're basically just making more personal grievances, or airing grievances about a private dispute, then the employer there may have a more colorable, legitimate argument that what you're saying is not on a matter of public concern. So again, that's the first part of this balancing test, and that is effectively the threshold question. And if the employee's speech here was on a matter of public concern, then the second part of the test kicks in, which is the question of disruption, i.e., did the employee's speech outweigh the employer's interest in having an efficient workplace? Did the employee's speech or protest disrupt the workplace to the point where the employer had a reasonable interest in ensuring smooth functioning of the workplace and therefore had legitimate grounds to discipline that employee? Now, what makes this a little bit more unique is that is a test that is generally for public employee speech rights. But as some of you are probably thinking, applying that same sort of standard to faculty members would really lose some of the uniqueness and some of what makes it special to be a faculty member and a member of a learned profession that is constantly arguing and debating and inquiring and potentially causing disruptions on campus. So that's where that academic freedom that was laid out in Garcetti v. Ceballos comes in, because there the Supreme Court actually held that the First Amendment did not protect speech pursuant to an employee's official duties. It did make an exception for quote unquote speech related to scholarship or teaching. Basically saying there that you can apply the same standard that you apply to all public employees when they're speaking pursuant to their official duties, but rather because of the faculty member's unique role as a public employee at a public institution, there had to be a carve out. Unfortunately, this exception is not that well defined, and it is yet to be really tested by the Supreme Court. But it is worth noting that the Supreme Court did note that there is something special and unique about, again, scholarship related to, speech related to scholarship or teaching, even if that exception has not been very well defined. So, what you should look out for and what you should know here is that academic freedom, again, protects your right to teach, to research, and to speak extramural speech, or AKA speech outside the classroom, even if that speech can be offensive or controversial. And what you should be aware of is looking for restrictions in the form of warnings or some sort of disciplinary action or the implicit threat of discipline based on the content or viewpoint that you're expressing. If you're, say, posting on social media or participating in other expression outside the classroom. And now to talk a little bit about the limits of academic freedom. What I was just talking about there, the idea of speaking pursuant to your employment as a public employee, where your speech may not be protected by the First Amendment is when you are acting as a university spokesperson. Institutions may properly regulate or discipline speech made on behalf of the university or when you're speaking as a representative of the university. Now, as you might imagine, this can be a very broadly construed exception, especially when universities may use this as a pretext to basically argue that identifying yourself as a faculty member, as a member of the faculty at a at an institution, therefore turns you into speaking on behalf or as a representative of the university. And that's an argument Fire has had with many universities the world over. But important to note here that they are able to properly regulate or control or discipline speech in some way when you're clearly speaking on behalf of a university or acting clearly again as a representative of the university. And that is a category that there will be many arguments over, no doubt, but important to note that exception. And then the other exception here to the academic freedom is the exceptions that are made to the First Amendment more broadly. Categories of unprotected speech, things like true threats, discriminatory harassment, other examples like unprotected incitement, speech integral to criminal conduct, potentially forms of pornography, all of those exceptions to the First Amendment also apply to limits of academic freedom as well. So important to note here that academic freedom, much like the First Amendment, is not totally absolute, but instead does abide by those categories of unprotected speech that the First Amendment carves out. Now, to talk a little bit about what is protected, controversial speech, the speech that oftentimes will be the speech that is targeted for punishment. Things like hate speech. Famously, if you're a fan of the First Amendment, you'll know that there is no specific category of unprotected speech known as hate speech. However, what we consider to be hate speech can oftentimes fall into one of those unprotected categories of speech. Things like dis and misinformation here, having the right to be wrong about things. Now, there again will be carve outs for, say, speech about criminal fraud or speech integral to criminal conduct. But broadly speaking, dis and misinformation will oftentimes be protected by the First Amendment. And then another controversial area that oftentimes has come up is things like advocacy or justifications for violence. And this has especially been something that has been quite present in debates and discourse on campus since the October 7th, 2023 attacks in Israel. Basically, how much of a defense of say Hamas's actions or Israel's actions constitute advocacy or justifications for violence and potentially cross the line into unprotected speech. The reality is, most of the time, that advocacy is going to be protected because the First Amendment makes clear, very clear protections for advocacy or justifications for violence. So, to wrap up here before we move into the question and answer section, what do you watch for? What should you look out for as a faculty member, and what can FIRE do to help? Well, rights violations can take on a number of different forms. These can be summons to investigatory meetings, interim suspensions, or even just the announcement of investigations. These can all represent a range of potential outcomes, including outcomes where you are eventually cleared of wrongdoing. But they can all have chilling effects on your expressive rights as a faculty member. And you should be alert about when these things rise up, when you are contacted about these things, and know your rights and know when to stand up for them. And the way to do that, well, one of the ways to do that, I should say, as we like to say at FIRE, is pull the fire alarm. You can contact as a faculty member at a public institution, the Faculty Legal Defense Fund hotline, the FLDF, which is what I work on. The number is there, 254-500-3533. You can talk to either me or one of my esteemed colleagues and walk through what's going on campus. And in qualifying cases, the Faculty Legal Defense Fund will arrange and fund a certain amount of legal representation for a faculty member to go through internal appeals processes, to engage with the university's investigation process, and to defend, help vindicate the rights of a faculty member, ideally without having to resort to litigation. If you are a faculty member at a private institution, or if you just have questions more broadly, I encourage you to contact FIRE's Campus Rights Advocacy Team, both of which is what Will and I work on. You can submit a case to us at thefire.org and clicking on the Submit a Case tab, or you can just reach out to me. I have my email right there, and I'm always happy to talk, to email, to try to connect you with the right resources, and to see if FIRE can be of assistance, or if we can't, then try to point you in the right direction. Beyond that, there are a number of academic freedom organizations that also will support faculty rights on campus, like the AAUP, or the Academic Freedom Alliance, or the ACLU. So know that when you are a faculty member under threat of some sort of investigation or punishment, there are many organizations, including FIRE, that will have your back. And now I'd be happy to take questions from the audience. Michael, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. All very fascinating. Thank you very much. I'm in Canada at the University of Winnipeg. So just a general point, I'd love to have a talk like this at some point about the Canadian context. We don't have a First Amendment. We have the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which guarantees free expression, but also has some limits on it, particularly as it relates to identities, protected identities. But I wanted to just touch base on something you said a few minutes ago about having no right to be wrong. I thought that the academic freedom did give you the right to be wrong, because there's always, debate, dialogue, correction.
Oh yeah, sorry to jump in. I said a right to be wrong.
Oh, you do have a right to be wrong. Okay.
Yeah. Sorry. That's a big clarification there. Sorry about
Okay, I appreciate that. Thanks. And then just one other quick thing. The tendency of administrations or faculty members to be filing respectful workplace complaints is kind of an administrative workaround on challenges to academic freedom. Do you have any thoughts about that, please?
Yeah, so FIRE has argued against broad civility policies or broad collegiality policies, basically exactly for those reasons, that they can lend themselves to spurious complaints, to complaints that try to get around the protections of the First Amendment, basically by making claims about respectful workplaces and workplaces, that can cohere together. And basically, there are going to be certain circumstances where, yeah, unprofessional behavior will be able to be punished. But the First Amendment also allows for, or understandings of free expression, allows for broad, heated debates, discussions, with that, provided that they don't fall into, again, those unprotected categories of speech that are protected by the First Amendment. So there it's balancing the rights of the employer to ensure a smooth workplace, while also making sure that they're not giving too much authority over or having these collegiality points that are so broad that they squelch or punish otherwise protected speech. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Noreen?
My question is in regard to private institutions. Sometimes mid-level administrator, well, any administrators really, also have faculty status. They may even be tenured and they're doing a gig in administration for a while, or, my question is, what academic freedom do people who have dual appointments and are tenured faculty members and administrators, what do they have? I was told by someone they don't have academic freedom, period, because the administrative role cancels that out. But I'm wondering what you would say to that. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we would argue that you have to differentiate there between the administrative position and the faculty position. Obviously, as a tenured faculty member, you're going to have the rights of tenure and the academic freedom rights of faculty. But in the administrative role, yeah, you're going to be bound by different requirements, and you won't probably enjoy the same range of academic freedom rights that a faculty member would. So I think we would push back on the idea that you don't have any academic freedom rights by nature of gaining your position as an administrator. But that's without knowing more and acknowledging that there are going to be limits on your ability if you do get one of those dual positions.
Thank you.
Martha?
Yeah, thanks. Graham, you said a little bit ago that disinformation is protected speech per the First Amendment, and that makes sense, but I didn't really hear you distinguish between classrooms and journal articles and the academic spaces from a public forum. So I see that somebody blogging from their basement can blog whatever disinformation they want or whatever hateful speech they want, and that is protected from government censorship. But could you speak to the fact that in a classroom, scholars and students are expected to show competence? They have no constitutional right to be incompetent at a university or in a classroom. And so that's really different from a citizen blogging or speaking in a public forum. I think
Yeah, and that's an
people get
important
confused by that.
Yeah, that's an important distinction, and that's a really good question, and a good point. And yeah, sorry, I was talking more broadly about what the First Amendment protects across the board. Yes, there are going to be academic and professional standards that you'll have to adhere to in a classroom, and it's also important to note that academic freedom does not protect, a long diatribe that's completely off topic. This is something that the AAUP lays out in its 1940 statement about academic freedom rights. Basically, that you are expected to act as a learned member of your profession, teach pedagogically relevant material, and then not use your class as an opportunity to go completely off topic and talk about whatever you want to talk about, international relations and say a mathematics course, unless there's a clear connection. So yeah, that is an important note to make there. There, I was talking more about the First Amendment broadly. But yeah, important distinction about classroom speech, which again is going to have more requirements on it, including departmental requirements and speech, extramural speech outside the classroom. Thank you. I think Brad was there. Or Brad was next.
Hi. So wondering about the relation between intramural and extramural speech. At a public university, we have an academic senate which deals with educational policy issues and the whole cluster of administrative issues that really surrounds all of that. And it seems like there's some implication that the university could actually retaliate against faculty members who criticize the university in regard to questions of educational policy. So I'm wondering where that stands.
Yeah, that's a topic that we've dealt with a lot. And to be completely honest, it's something that is a matter of debate, I think, for courts, whether or not that qualifies as a matter of public concern under the Pickering-Connick test that I was discussing. I think there's a much stronger argument to be made at a public institution where it's taxpayer funded, that is a matter of public concern. And certainly FIRE has taken the stance that we should interpret that matter of public concern category broadly, which includes the operations and governance of a school. And also important to note there that, you should have the right as a faculty member when you're participating in faculty governance to speak out and to criticize potential policies or developments that you disagree with under that right. Obviously, that's something that universities are not going to take very kindly to. And again, that can be a matter of debate, just how much of a matter of public concern those things are. Again, we take a very expansive view. We would argue that by and large, they are matters of public concern. But certainly that is going to be something that can be a matter of debate if that does get in front of a court. Again, with FIRE taking the stance that we should interpret matters of public concern as a very broad category to allow faculty members to speak out and to criticize university governance and operations. Wallace?
Thank you, and thanks for doing this. And also, I love the Heterodox Academy. Many times as administrators, let's say public institutions, somebody will be presenting something, and then they'll say something verbally like, all right, I'm going to take off my administrator hat and I'm going to put on my professor hat, or I'm going to take off my professor hat and I'm going to be a citizen in the following statement. Does that carry any weight at all in determining when somebody's speaking on behalf of the university or their own self?
I think it would probably have to be a case-by-case basis there. Without knowing the exact context, yeah, it's a little hard to say. I think just in terms of from a normative perspective, I think that should be taken in good faith when an administrator is saying something like that. However, I tend to think that a clearer sort of delineation, beyond just an aside comment like that, something as informal as I'm taking off one hat and putting on another. I think generally speaking, administrators probably should be a little bit more deliberate and clear about when they're speaking on behalf of an institution and behalf of or as in a personal capacity, and probably should be a little bit careful about that. But again, that's sort of a normative question. Looking at it under a First Amendment analysis, without knowing more, it's kind of hard to say. Sorry, I understand that's a bit of a cop out, but that is kind of a complicated question. Okay, I think now I'm going to hand it over to Will for the next portion of the presentation. Gabriel, I see that you have your hand up. If you'd like to just shoot me a message over chat with your question, I'd be happy to answer it there. But otherwise, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Will, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen. But I appreciate everyone listening and the very good questions.
Thanks, Graham. And we hopefully should have time for some more Q&A at the end of my presentation as well. But I'm excited to share a bit about Let's Talk with you all today. Let's Talk is FIRE's signature civil discourse initiative, and it's great to see some familiar faces and names in the Zoom call today. We brought Let's Talk to 9 campuses last school year, and the majority of those visits were hosted by Heterodox Academy campus communities. So I want to start off this presentation today in a similar way to how I started those in-person events where the room was filled not only with HXA faculty members, but also students from a variety of clubs and interests and backgrounds. I shared with them this quote: "I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." This is from Evelyn Beatrice Hall's biography of Voltaire, and she's paraphrasing his attitude towards free expression. And I was sharing on those campuses how this encapsulates what we mean at FIRE when we talk about a principled, nonpartisan defense of free speech. You know, it's not about sympathy with the content of the speech, it's about sympathy with the right of the speaker to speak their mind. And on those campuses, I would ask the room, and we'd have about, 40 people, 20 people, decent amount of folks, to raise their hand if they felt that this quote encapsulated the campus environment when it came to free expression. And every single time we would have maybe 0 hands raised, maybe 1 hand raised, maybe somewhere in between, a half hand, very tentative sort of gesture, but we never had anything more than that. It was really reinforcing of the importance of the work that groups like Heterodox Academy and FIRE do to improve the situation on campus. But the evidence isn't just anecdotal or from my visits to campuses through Let's Talk. FIRE actually runs the largest survey of undergraduates every year, and we use that data along with other sources like review of schools' policies and other metrics to rank schools on free speech. So I'm picking the University of Pennsylvania as an example just because I work out of FIRE's Philadelphia office, but really these numbers are representative trends we see at schools across the country. And I want to really draw your attention to the 39% metric. This is the exact opposite of that Voltaire quote that we would love people to embrace. 39% of students at UPenn, rather than saying, I'll defend your right to free speech to the death, say that it's okay actually for violence to be used against you to stop you from speaking. So that's a pretty alarming metric there. Almost 40% of students think that violence is okay to shut down a speaker. So clearly, civil discourse and support for it is something that's lacking a little bit. And that's really where FIRE comes in. I know Graham spoke to our mission a bit earlier, and we litigate, we fight in the court of law. But one of the things that makes us unique is we also fight in the court of public opinion, and we try and create what we call a free speech culture. We're really invested in the public education piece and trying to change the terms of consensus when it comes to what's acceptable and what's not, more towards the Voltaire and a little bit less towards the inverse. And that's how Let's Talk fits in to FIRE's mission. So today, I'd like to introduce some of the strategies we use in Let's Talk Civil Discourse Programming, including a new format we just adopted from the Mercatus Center called Triadic Illumination. We'll review those strategies through some example exercises, And then, time allowing, we can reflect together on how those strategies might be used in college classrooms or in your pedagogy. But Let's Talk basically addresses the central cultural problem. We believe that civil discourse skills are like a muscle that we've allowed to atrophy in an era of intense polarization and toxic partisanship. So Let's Talk is really a way to flex those civic muscles once again, kind of go to the gym, practice them so that we can regain a society that embraces curiosity and authenticity rather than reflexive certainty and a shutting down of openness to other points of view. So pluralism is the goal, and we have a lot of strategies drawing on all the different theories on screen to try and achieve that. But it's also a great way to just get people in a room together who care about free speech, heterodox opinions, and build community around that. So that's a big piece of it as well. But without further ado, would like to share the actual strategies that we recommend as part of Let's Talk. And the first piece of that is really about building community. FIRE has a staff that really shows we practice what we preach when it comes to nonpartisanship. We range the entire political spectrum. And I wouldn't say that politics are taboo in the office. We know that our staff is politically diverse. So how do we then work effectively on advocating on the most contentious issues of the day? Well, these are kind of the four guiding values we've landed on that help us be effective in our jobs and at the same time very openly plural and dissenting of different political stripes. Staying principled, presuming goodwill, seeking different perspectives, and embracing that it's challenging. Free speech is always under attack. People don't like their opinions being challenged, but we find that exciting and embrace that as an exciting challenge. So we always recommend that discourse groups adopt these values or something similar and remind folks when you kick off your group discussion of these sort of guiding principles. Some of it might seem intuitive, especially if you're a Heterodox Academy member, but just giving this reminder at the beginning of a discussion can go a long way in reminding people what the common purpose and shared ground is all about. And then these guidelines are from our president and CEO, Greg Lukianov's book, The Coddling of the American Mind, where he and Jonathan Haidt were drawing from the psychologist Adam Grant's suggestions on how to ensure productive discussion. And the first is really about framing. Rather than viewing your disagreement as a conflict, frame it as a debate, a battle of ideas, not a battle of people. And then the second one, it's in the name, civil discourse. We often think about it through the speech component. What are we going to say? How are we going to say it? But it's just as much about the listening portion. Obviously, just be a civils in the name doesn't mean you shouldn't argue vigorously. You should argue like you're right. You should make your case very persuasively, but taking the time to listen for holes in your argument and assuming that you're wrong can really go a long way in building that rapport, especially through active listening. When someone says something you hadn't considered or whatever, articulating that it goes a long way as well. And we try and emphasize that to college students in our Let's Talk sessions. The other two things we emphasize are, and this goes back to the core values, presuming goodwill, assuming people are disagreeing in good faith, making the most respectful interpretation rather than playing gotcha games or assuming the worst. And then back to what I was saying earlier, really actively commenting when you learn something or where you agree with your critics. And maybe you don't learn anything or agree with them. It could even just be, I've never heard it argued that way before. But articulating that is something we always recommend to students because it can help remind people that the point of this exercise is to build up comfort, being authentic in what we believe, not self-censor, and get past some of those self-censorship metrics I showed you earlier, sample from UPenn, where we have, big portions of campuses saying they self-censor on campus 2 to 3 times a month. Another thing we adopt in Let's Talk discussions is the Chatham House rule. And it basically boils down to the ideas can leave the room, but who suggested them can't. So obviously we want civil discourse to be a tool for learning. I heard that Jonathan Rauch's Constitution of Knowledge was a Heterodox Academy recommended book recently. And obviously, we want this civil discourse to be part of that knowledge creation process. So the ideas should definitely leave the room, and we want to remind people to take what they learn out of the room. But it can really stop self-censorship quite effectively, really in its tracks, if we set this rule where the people who share those ideas, especially if they're more heterodox or controversial, their identities won't be disclosed outside of the room. And as a college student myself, when I was participating in FIRE's Let's Talk programming, I always found this rule to make a big difference for me personally. So I definitely recommend this one. Another thing that we do in Let's Talk is we structure our conversations through heat levels. So rather than jumping straight into the fray of, the most contentious topic in the news that week, we start with community building and rapport building exercises, which we call heat level 0, really getting to know people, seeing people as people before we get into the issues, building those human relationships. Then heat levels 1 through 3 are all disagreeable, debatable topics. The thing that distinguishes them is not how debatable they are, but rather how likely they are to, provoke a personal reaction or really call up someone's own experience or just feel more sensitive to people emotionally and personally. So an example of heat level 1 might be something more vague and conceptual, maybe more philosophical, like what does freedom mean? When do you feel like you're exercising freedom? Whereas heat level 3 is more likely to, maybe bring up a personal experience of someone's that could be more emotional and just is maybe a little more dicey for conversation. So an example of that one is, should hate speech be considered free speech? And they're usually less conceptual and vague. And we find that starting with 0, working up from 1 through 3, oftentimes because people are actually practicing the same skills the entire time, it goes smoother once you get to 3 than if you just jumped straight into it. So now that we've gone through the guidelines that Let's Talk recommends, I'd like to actually share some of the civil discourse games and exercises that college students will often do when they form Let's Talk groups. Like I said, one of these is brand new. Developed the triadic illumination technique in partnership with the Mercatus Center, which also spun off the Pluralist Lab, which is a new group dedicated to this technique. That's a really cool one. We'll review that, and then we'll start going through some of the heat levels. We won't have time to hit all of them today, but we'll start by reviewing a heat level 0 commonalities exercise, what that might look like. And then we're going to do a heat level 1 question through the triadic illumination format. So please keep in mind, if you're willing to be a volunteer, we will need 3 volunteers later in this call. So first, I want to share how triadic illumination works. This is a really cool format to illuminate a controversy or an issue from 3 sides. The first is the proponent of a stance. The second is the opponent of that stance. And the third is undecided or in between. And that third person is really crucial. They're built into the format, and part of the goal of triadic illumination is to get people to be thoughtful and really consider whether or not they want to choose one of the extremes, because we pick prompts that usually oscillate towards those 2 poles, versus whether or not they want to think about it in a more nuanced way, or maybe not rush towards this reflexive certainty that we're trying to challenge. So that third stance is a really important piece of it. But the goal, as that embodies, is building viewpoint diversity. And also, before people share their own views in the triadic illumination format, have them actually inhabit the viewpoint of their opponent. So it's viewpoint diversity in action. It's pluralism lived. And the goal here is about learning and exploring the different ways of thinking about an issue more than it is pressing your case and arguing it, though, of course, there is open discussion as well. So this is kind of the whole thing broken down into one slide, and then we'll do it bit by bit in a second. But an example of how triadic illumination works is you have a question like, which animal brings humans greater happiness, cats or dogs? And then we have paddles with Let's Talk, colored paddles, orange, purple, and rose. And we'll ask the students to raise their placard if they think cats bring humans greater happiness, then raise their paddles if they think dogs do, that's purple. And then that undecided third stance, they raise the rose placard. And we'll comment on it so that everyone can see there's some viewpoint diversity in the room. Maybe we have 5 orange, 3 purple, 10 rose. And then we'll delve into each stance one by one. So we'll pick a representative who believes dogs are best to inhabit the viewpoint of someone who believes that cats are best. We'll ask them to explain that viewpoint. And then the person who actually holds that viewpoint will share what they got right about their view and then what they would add or what might have been missing. And then we'll do the inverse. And then at the end, once both polar viewpoints have been articulated and there's been some back and forth from the people who actually believe them versus the people guessing at it, we'll have that undecided person come in and share their thoughts now that they've heard from both points of view and people trying to approximate their ideological opposites point of view. And that can be really illuminating. So because it's a little bit of a complicated format, just to break it down visually, we'll always have 3 options in a triadic illumination exercise. The response option 1 is a prompt, again, often skewing more towards one extreme of an issue. And response option 2, in orange, is going to be skewing towards the other extreme. And then there's always the option in the middle, which plays a really important role. So in the example we just saw, all in one piece, broken up, we would share these 2 prompts with everyone. And someone in the middle might say, oh, well, your prompt's poorly written. If you'd written dogs are better than cats, but cats are still good, I would have chosen purple, but you didn't put that caveat in there. We welcome that. Like, we hope people take an issue with the prompts because that is engaging in more of a thoughtful, nuanced mode than rushing into a tribal camp. So we want the prompts to be somewhat disagreeable in Let's Talk Triadic Illumination exercises. And then we have everyone raise their paddles. We reveal where people stand on the issue, comment on the split, see that viewpoint diversity around us. And then we'll have cats explain why someone who raised a purple paddle thinks dogs are better than cats. Then we'll have someone who actually held that view explain what orange got right, how well they captured your actual arguments, what else you would like to add in addition, or what they might have missed or gotten wrong about your point of view. Then we do the exact inverse, pick someone who thinks dogs are better than cats to make the opposite argument. Why does orange think cats are better than dogs? And then we'll have someone who actually believed that, the orange person, come back in and share what the dog's proponent got right, what they got wrong, what they'd add. And then finally, we will move to that third position and ask them their opinions now that they've heard a back and forth based on the 2 kind of polar extremes. So this is it again in review. Does anyone have any questions before we dive in and do an example? And then I'm going to need volunteers. So if you wouldn't mind raising your hand through the Zoom raise hand function, if you would like to volunteer, that would be great. Okay, looks like no questions. Can we get some volunteers? Okay, Richard. All right. Well, while we wait for more volunteers, let's go through the commonalities exercise. This one we'll just review, and then we can do volunteers for the next exercise. Gabriel and Richard, have you both down for volunteering for the next piece? So for the commonalities exercise, this is heat level 0. We'll recommend that people break themselves into teams of 3 or 4 and find things they have in common. And then what we do after people discover their commonalities in small groups is we share what those commonalities are out with the wider group, just trying to build rapport and community, especially if it's a group of discussants who don't know each other or are coming from different parts of campus. And it's usually pretty effective. We do try and tell people not to pick things like, oh, we all go to, the University of Pennsylvania or things like that. But favorite movies, holidays, activities, those things can often be good at building bonds. We give people 5 minutes to divide themselves, and then we have them pick one representative to share with the wider group, and that heat level 0 is often a good way to start. And we're not going to do this today, but if we had broken out into groups, that would be the next step, would be after discussing in small groups, come back and share with everyone. So now we're going to dive into heat level 1. We're going to do this through the triadic illumination format. So I just need one more volunteer, but it might actually be best to look at the question first and the prompts. So the question is, should the government institute a carbon tax to reduce emissions? So this is a good example of a heat level 1 question. And then we have two kind of extremes here. Purple is yes, the government should institute a carbon tax by imposing a fee on the amount of carbon dioxide emissions generated, creating financial incentives for businesses and consumers to reduce their fossil fuel use and shift toward cleaner energy. And then orange is no, the government should not institute a carbon tax as it places unnecessary economic burdens on businesses and consumers without effectively guaranteeing reduced emissions. So ideally, it'd be great if I had a volunteer who wanted to argue purple or argue orange or take the rose stance.
I can argue purple.
Awesome. Oh, you're muted.
I can argue orange.
Wonderful. And then Gabriel, do you want to do rose?
That was perfect because that's what I wanted. So
amazing. Wow, this is great luck. 3 volunteers, all perfectly aligned with the format. Great. So we kind of just did this, but in an in-person triadic illumination exercise, we'd have people raise the colored Let's Talk paddles, or sometimes folks will just use like colored construction paper if they don't have those paddles. And then we can kind of look around the room, see where people stand. Today, it's great. Came really quickly and easily. We got 3 volunteers, 1 for each camp. So let's start with orange. Can you try and articulate why you think purple believes the government should implement a carbon tax?
So I think supporters of the purple position believe that carbon dioxide emissions need to be reduced, and the best way to do this is through market principles by basically increasing the cost of activities that produce carbon, thereby incentivizing people to try to avoid the tax by reducing those activities and thus thereby reducing carbon emissions.
Great, thank you. And then turning to purple, what did orange get right? What do you feel was missing?
I would say that orange got the part right that purple advocates of the carbon tax believe in market principles. What was missing, I think, was the importance of just the price mechanism in how consumers and investors make decisions. That you can sort of have all sorts of special pleading of people to do what they want to do, but if it's not reflected in prices, I don't think you're going to see much of a behavioral response.
Thank you. And then we're going to do the same thing in reverse. So sticking with purple, the proponent of the carbon tax, if you could now share why you believe orange doesn't think the government should implement a carbon tax.
Well, the orange side, well, first there was as I recall the slide, there was concern that the carbon tax would not guarantee a particular outcome. That is unambiguously true. And they think that it would be burdensome, which is also unambiguously true. It would increase the costs of products that feature carbon emissions in their production or use.
And then going back to Orange, what do you think Purple got right, or what do you feel was missing?
Well, both of the arguments that Purple made are valid, but they aren't really the main argument that I was looking at. The argument I was looking at is that the use of a carbon tax mandated by the government is inherently inequitable because it basically forces the, excuse me, it basically enables the rich to continue to live a lifestyle that produces lots of carbon because they can afford to pay for it, whereas the poor who may actually be, just struggling just to keep the heat in their apartment or, to get to and from work, that they don't have the discretionary income to pay more tax. They may not even have the ability to reduce their already smaller footprint any further. So in a way, it's the government. It's very inequitable of the government to do it in this way.
Good. Thank you. And then finally, turning to Rose, now that you've heard from both perspectives and them guessing at each other's arguments, what are your thoughts?
I am unchanged. I believe that there should be a carbon tax with a lot of caveats to avoid the situations that Orange is describing. And that's more or less like my position. It's not an all or nothing. There should be some kind of tiered time tax thing, like not right away, but it's coming. This is what's going to happen. Lots of exemptions to avoid this inequity issue.
Thank you. And I like what you said when you said, it's not all or nothing. That's actually something I've heard students say something similar to in response to these prompts. And we'll share a link to our online resource library, but we have a bunch of sample prompts and we try and word them in a way where people will want to add their own caveats or want to take a more nuanced approach than maybe both extremes. And of course, if you do fall down on one more extreme or another side of an issue, that's obviously fine too. But as we're trying to build people's civil discourse muscles and embrace complexity and nuance, it can be helpful for folks to look at the two prompts and say, oh, I don't know if it's all that black and white or all that all or nothing. But would love to hear from the group any reflections on the triadic illumination format, the heat levels, how that little sample exercise went. These are the questions we often pose to students when we do these exercises with them. How did the commonality exercise influence discussion, things like that. We don't have a ton of time left, so feel free to drop your comments reflecting on these techniques in the chat if you have anything to share. But I would love to hear from the group if anyone wants to share an idea of how they might integrate these techniques in their classroom. And you can just use your raised hand feature if anyone has any ideas. And if not, you can continue to think on it. Oh, yes, go ahead.
So I've used a technique somewhat similar. I wouldn't say it's exactly the same. And the problem you run into is what you'd see even if you use this method is the thesis statements on each side. They work if you have something where A caused by B versus C caused by D. But when you have many different possible options for why you would support orange or why you would support purple, you can end up in a situation where the two sides are talking past each other because they might not necessarily disagree on the yes and no, but the reasons for why can be very, very different. And I mean, it can be very good because students begin to think about things they had never thought of before. That, oh, it never occurred to me that X. But when you have the real world is complex, and so it may not always work in this simple format.
No, definitely. And I think that even being an active part of the discussion or the exercise is something we've invited. I mean, oftentimes participants in these will problematize the prompts themselves. And I think that's a really good way also of really living out the pluralist ethos behind it, is, you know, not just subscribing to those presets. Can be a good prompt, I think. And I want to also plug our online resource library at thefire.org/let's talk. I saw someone shared in the comments that they would love a round 2 or to go deeper into these. Absolutely. This is really just a sample, a little compressed for this webinar format of how it all works. Usually we'll open it up to open-ended discussion after you go through the triadic illumination pieces, because it's so structured. And it's a good way to kick things off, but we want people to be able to go back and forth a little more organically too. But for that, more details on triadic illumination, sample questions and prompts, and a whole host of different civil discourse games, you can go to our website at that link and just learn more about the program and what Let's Talk is all about. I also wanted to share my contact info. Feel free to reach out to me with anything civil discourse related. As Graham mentioned, we both also work on FIRE's campus rights advocacy team. So, of course, please get in touch with one of us or the general FIRE pull the fire alarm form if your rights are violated or you're aware of a censorship incident on your campus. And then finally, if there's any questions about civil discourse, free speech, Let's Talk strategies, would be glad to answer any questions now. There's a question in the chat, I think, for Graham. All right.
Yeah, sorry, I just answered that. That's a really good question, though. Just briefly, if we have a couple minutes, Sajardin, am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yep, good enough.
You asked a question. What about academic freedom from interference by professional societies? Faculty are required to conduct and present their research as part of their participation in the profession, but only if they make a presentation on their research that is factually accurate on a matter of public concern in the discipline in question. But the society can retract and expel the speaker based on the content/conclusions of the work. And if all that is the case, do we really have academic freedom? And I would just say, I wrote this out. That's a really good question. It is worth noting that academic freedom under the First Amendment, again, the First Amendment restrains public institutions, restrains governmental bodies from interfering. Professional societies, provided that they are private institutions, do have their own First Amendment rights to set certain standards and enforce certain standards. Now, I would think that it very much depends on the situation. I think we would probably argue that as a normative matter, they should abide, private societies, private organizations should abide by the policies that they set out in the same way that private universities do. But certainly they have the First Amendment right to determine what they do and do not publish. So it can be a little bit of a complicated situation, and you may get into more normative arguments as opposed to legalistic arguments. But a really good question and definitely worth chewing on a bit more.
Great. Well, Will and Graham, we thank you so much for being here. Their contact information was shared. Maybe Marissa, you can drop that in the chat before they leave. So if you do have any follow-up questions for our friends over at FIRE, please do let them know. We appreciate you all coming and participating. Our next member workshop will be held in mid-October. We're just finalizing the details this week. So please do keep an eye on your email and our events page for our next workshop. And we hope to see many of you next month. Well, Graham, thanks again. And thank you to all of you members for showing up today. Appreciate it.